The moment my daughter-in-law called my Thanksgiving dinner garbage, I realized the meal wasn't what she had come to destroy. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. More than Christmas. More than birthdays. More than any celebration marked on a calendar. It was the one day each year when I could gather the people I loved around a table and remind myself that family still meant something. That Thursday morning, I woke up at 5 o'clock, just as I had for nearly 40 years. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. I tied on my faded blue apron, the one my late husband Michael had bought me during a trip to Vermont almost 20 years earlier, and began preparing dinner. By sunrise, the turkey was already in the oven. The scent of rosemary, butter, and sage slowly filled the kitchen. Sweet potatoes cooled on the counter. Fresh rolls rested beneath a towel. Pumpkin pies sat perfectly golden beside a pecan pie I had spent nearly an hour decorating. At 72 years old, my knees ached and my back protested every trip between the kitchen and dining room, but I ignored the discomfort. Some things were worth the effort. My son Ryan, my daughter-in-law Emily, and my 2 grandchildren were expected at noon. I set the table with my best china. The same set Michael and I had saved for years to purchase when Ryan was a boy. As I arranged the silverware, I found myself glancing toward the framed photograph near the fireplace. Michael smiled back at me from behind the glass. It had been 3 years since I lost him, yet some mornings I still expected to hear his footsteps in the hallway. By 11:45, the food was ready. The turkey glistened beneath the kitchen lights. Everything looked perfect. At exactly 12:10, I heard tires crunching across the driveway. A few moments later, the front door opened. Ryan entered first. He gave me a brief hug. Emily followed behind him. She wore an expensive cream-colored sweater and an expression that suggested she would rather be anywhere else. The grandchildren rushed inside and disappeared toward the living room. For a little while, everything seemed normal. We sat around the table. Plates were filled. Small talk drifted through the room. I told a story about a neighbor's dog escaping through a fence. The children laughed. Ryan smiled politely. Then Emily took a bite of turkey. She set down her fork. The room became strangely quiet. She stared at her plate for several seconds before looking directly at me. "You spent all day making this?" she asked. I felt my smile weaken. "I did." Emily laughed softly. Not a warm laugh. Not a kind one. The sort of laugh people use when they've already made up their minds. "You call this food?" she said. No one answered. Ryan lowered his eyes toward his plate. The grandchildren stopped talking. Emily shook her head and pushed the dish away. "Honestly, Margaret, this is garbage. I don't know how anyone can eat it." The words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. I waited for Ryan to say something. Anything. A defense. A correction. A simple request for respect. Instead, he reached for his glass and took a sip of water. That silence hurt more than Emily's criticism ever could. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. My hands trembled, but only slightly. Emily leaned back in her chair, looking satisfied, as if she had accomplished exactly what she intended. In that moment, I understood something important. This wasn't about turkey. It wasn't about dinner. It wasn't even about Thanksgiving. This had been building for years. And as I looked around the table, I realized I was finally seeing my family exactly as they were. After dinner ended, nobody mentioned what had happened. The children wandered into the family room to watch television. Ryan helped himself to a second cup of coffee. Emily scrolled through her phone as though the evening had been perfectly normal. I stood alone in the kitchen, rinsing plates beneath warm water, while the scent of turkey and cinnamon lingered in the air. The house felt different now. Smaller somehow. Colder. Every laugh drifting in from the next room seemed distant, as though I were listening from the outside of my own life. For years, I had convinced myself that Emily and I simply had different personalities. She was outspoken. I was reserved. She liked control. I preferred peace. Whenever friends hinted that she treated me poorly, I always found an excuse. Whenever neighbors noticed tension, I explained it away. Family required patience, I told myself. Family required grace. But standing at that sink, Staring through the dark kitchen window, I began replaying memories I had ignored for far too long. There was the Christmas 6 years earlier, when Emily decided dinner would be hosted at her house instead of mine. She never told me directly. I learned about it from a social media post 2 days before the holiday. Then there was my granddaughter's dance recital. I had been given the wrong starting time and arrived after the performance ended. Emily apologized with a smile, but later Ryan admitted she had purchased the tickets herself. There was always an explanation, always a misunderstanding, always some small detail that made me question my own instincts. Yet when I line those moments together, they no longer looked accidental. They looked deliberate. I dried a plate and placed it back in the cabinet. My hands moved automatically. My thoughts did not. Around 7 o'clock, the family began preparing to leave. The grandchildren hugged me goodbye. Their affection was genuine, and for a moment it softened the ache in my chest. They were innocent in all of this. Emily collected her purse and called for everyone to head toward the car. Ryan lingered near the front door. For several seconds, it seemed as though he wanted to say something. An apology, perhaps. An explanation. Instead, he simply adjusted his jacket. "Thanks for dinner, Mom," he said quietly. I nodded. "Drive safely." He gave a brief smile and walked away. The front door closed behind them. Silence immediately settled across the house. I stood in the entryway for a long time. The grandfather clock ticked steadily beside the staircase. The same clock Michael used to wind every Sunday evening without fail. Finally, I turned off the dining room lights and began clearing the remaining dishes. One chair remained slightly pulled away from the table. Michael's chair. Nobody sat there anymore, but I could never bring myself to move it. I lowered myself into the seat beside it and looked around the room. The candles had nearly burned out. The tablecloth was stained with gravy and cranberry sauce. Half a pie remained untouched. Thanksgiving used to leave me feeling grateful and exhausted. This year it left me questioning everything. I glanced toward the photograph on the mantel again. Michael's familiar smile seemed unchanged by time. He had always noticed things before I did. People, motives, hidden intentions. More than once he warned me not to ignore what was right in front of me. Back then I thought he worried too much. That night, for the first time, I wondered whether he had seen something I refused to see. The thought stayed with me long after I climbed the stairs. Long after I changed into my nightgown. Long after the house fell completely quiet. And when the first pale light of morning finally appeared through my bedroom curtains, I made a decision. There was one place I needed to go. One thing I needed to open. A place Michael had asked me to remember if I ever felt truly alone. The next morning, I left the house just after 8 o'clock. A thin layer of frost still covered the grass, and the sky hung low and gray above the neighborhood. I drove the same route Michael and I had taken hundreds of times over the years. Past the church where we were married. Past the diner where we celebrated Ryan's high school graduation. Past the small hardware store Michael loved even when he had no reason to buy anything. The memories followed me like silent passengers. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot of First National Bank. The building looked exactly as it had the last time Michael and I visited together. Clean brick walls. Tall windows. American flags gently moving in the cold morning breeze. For a moment, I remained seated inside my car. My hands rested on the steering wheel. My heart felt strangely heavy. Michael had mentioned the safe deposit box only twice. The first time was years ago when we were organizing important documents. The second was during the final weeks of his illness. Back then, I did not want to hear conversations about paperwork or future plans. I wanted to believe there would be more time. Yet I still remembered his exact words. "If there ever comes a day when you feel completely alone, promise me you will open the box." At the time, I laughed and told him he worried too much. Now those words echoed clearly in my mind. Inside the bank, everything smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. A young teller greeted me warmly before directing me toward a private office. After verifying my identification, the manager escorted me downstairs to the secure vault area. The corridor felt quiet, almost reverent. When he finally placed the small metal box in front of me, he left the room and closed the door behind him. Suddenly, I was alone. I stared at the box for several seconds before inserting the key. My fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear. From uncertainty. I had no idea what I was about to find. The lock clicked open. Inside were several neatly organized folders, a sealed envelope bearing my name, and a small leather journal that immediately caught my attention. The sight of Michael's handwriting stopped me cold. Even after 3 years, I recognized every curve and line of his penmanship. Carefully, I opened the envelope first. A letter rested inside. My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has happened that made you question people you trusted. I felt my throat tighten. Michael knew me well enough to understand exactly how long I would ignore warning signs before finally searching for answers. I continued reading. The letter was not dramatic. It was not angry. It was written in the same calm voice he always used when speaking to me. He reminded me of the life we built together, the sacrifices we made, the promises we kept. Then one sentence made me stop breathing for a moment. There are truths about our family that you do not know yet. I blinked and read the line again. Truths. Plural. Michael had never been a man who exaggerated. If he chose those words, he meant them. Beneath the letter sat several folders marked with dates stretching back nearly a decade. I opened the first one. Inside were copies of financial records, notes written by Michael, and documents I did not immediately understand. Some names appeared repeatedly. Ryan's name, Emily's name. Several transactions had been highlighted in yellow. Questions filled my mind faster than I could process them. Why had Michael collected all of this information? What had he discovered? And why had he never shown it to me? I closed the folder and looked down at the journal resting beside it. Something told me the answers were waiting inside those pages. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something stronger than sadness. I felt curiosity. Because whatever Michael had left behind, he clearly wanted me to see the truth for myself. I carried the journal home and placed it on the kitchen table. For nearly an hour, I simply stared at it. Outside, the afternoon sun drifted lower across the backyard Michael had loved so much. The maple tree near the fence had already lost most of its leaves, leaving scattered patches of gold across the grass. Everything looked ordinary, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Finally, I opened the journal. The first pages contained simple notes, dates, observations, reminders about maintenance on the house and investments we owned together. It looked exactly like the kind of record Michael always kept. Organized, practical, careful. Then I reached an entry written 8 years earlier. Ryan and Emily asked about transferring ownership again today. I frowned. Ownership of what? I turned the page. Another note appeared 6 months later. Emily believes Margaret does not understand our finances. She is mistaken. I felt a chill move through me. The handwriting remained calm and precise, but the meaning behind the words felt different. More watchful, more concerned. I continued reading. Over the next several years, Michael had documented dozens of conversations. Small details I never knew existed. Requests from Ryan and Emily to restructure accounts. Suggestions that certain assets be placed in their names. Questions about the house. Questions about future inheritance. Questions that seemed harmless on their own, but formed a troubling pattern when viewed together. I remembered those years differently. Ryan and Emily visiting for dinner, birthday celebrations, summer barbecues, family photographs on the back deck. Yet according to Michael's notes, entirely different conversations had been happening beneath the surface. One entry stopped me completely. Emily asked whether Margaret would ever consider downsizing. She mentioned retirement communities again. Ryan remained quiet. I stared at the sentence for a long time. That conversation had taken place almost 5 years earlier. 5 years. Long before Michael became ill. Long before anyone would have expected me to live alone. Suddenly, Thanksgiving looked different in my memory. Emily's criticism. Ryan's silence. The satisfaction on her face. It no longer felt like a spontaneous outburst. It felt like part of a much longer story. I closed the journal and walked to the living room. The photograph of Michael remained on the mantel. I picked it up carefully. What exactly did you know? I whispered. The house offered no answer. Only silence. Returning to the journal, I found a folded sheet of paper tucked between two pages near the back. Unlike the earlier notes, this document carried a bold heading: Personal Observations. The first line immediately caught my attention. If Margaret ever reads this, she deserves context. My pulse quickened. Michael went on to describe changes he had noticed after Ryan married Emily. Not dramatic changes. Subtle ones. Fewer visits. More financial questions. More pressure regarding decisions that had previously belonged to our family alone. He never accused anyone of wrongdoing. That was not his style. Instead, he recorded facts, patterns, behaviors, things that made him uneasy. One sentence lingered in my mind. Never judge people by what they say they value. Judge them by what they pursue when they think nobody is watching. I read those words 3 times. Then 4. As evening settled outside, another realization slowly formed. Michael had not created this journal because he distrusted me. He created it because he knew I trusted too easily. He understood something I did not. Love can make people overlook what is directly in front of them, especially when the people involved are family. I closed the journal and looked toward the stack of folders I had brought home from the bank. Until then, I had only glanced at the documents. Now I felt ready to examine them more closely, because whatever truth Michael had spent years documenting, I had only uncovered the beginning of it. The following morning, I spread the folders across my dining room table and began reading them one by one. Outside, a cold wind rattled the bare branches in the backyard, but inside the house everything remained still. The same table that had hosted decades of family dinners had become something else entirely. It was no longer a place for celebration. It had become a place for answers. The first folder contained property records. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Deeds, tax statements, insurance documents, papers Michael always kept organized. Then I noticed handwritten notes attached to several pages. Some were only a sentence long. Others filled entire sheets. Each note explained why certain decisions had been made and why specific assets had never been transferred despite repeated suggestions from Ryan and Emily. I sat back in my chair and stared at one particular note for several minutes. Michael had written it 6 years earlier. Ryan believes simplifying ownership would make things easier for everyone. Emily agrees. I disagree. Their interest seems unusually persistent. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Unusually persistent. That sounded exactly like Michael. Careful, measured, never dramatic. Yet the more documents I reviewed, the more often similar observations appeared. There were records of conversations I never knew happened, requests I never heard discussed, questions about future inheritance that seemed oddly premature considering Michael had been healthy at the time. Around noon, my phone rang. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call. Instead, I answered. Mum. His voice sounded casual. Phrase immediately caught my attention. What kind of things? I asked. Another pause followed. Just future planning. The house. Maintenance. Making life easier for you. The words were polite. Reasonable even. Yet after everything I had read, they felt different. I remembered the journal entries. The repeated discussions about downsizing. The interest in ownership. The years of quiet pressure. That is thoughtful, I said calmly. Let me think about it. Ryan sounded surprised. Usually I agreed immediately whenever he suggested something. Sure, he replied. No rules. After we ended the call, I remained seated for a long time. My eyes drifted toward the photograph of Michael on the mantel. For years I had viewed these conversations through the eyes of a mother. Now I was beginning to view them through Michael's eyes. The difference was unsettling. Later that afternoon, I opened another folder. This one contained correspondence from an attorney. Most of it involved estate planning. I expected dry legal language. Instead, I found something that made my pulse quicken. Attached to one document was a memorandum prepared at Michael's request. Certain assets are protected under separate ownership structures and may not be transferred without specific conditions being satisfied. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Protected. Separate ownership. Specific conditions. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces began shifting into a new shape. Michael had not merely documented concerns. He had acted on them. Quietly. Methodically. Years before his death. The realization left me staring out the window as daylight slowly faded. For the first time, I understood that whatever Ryan and Emily believed about our family's future might be very different from reality. And if that was true, then Michael had spent years preparing for a moment he hoped would never come. A moment when I would finally need to understand exactly what he had protected and exactly who he had been protecting it from. For the next several days, I said nothing. I did not call Ryan. I did not confront Emily. I did not mention the documents to anyone. Instead, I continued my routine exactly as before. Every morning, I watered the plants in the kitchen window. Every afternoon, I walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. Every evening, I sat in Michael's old recliner and watched the local news. From the outside, my life appeared unchanged. Inside, however, something had shifted. The more I read, the more carefully I began observing the people around me. On Saturday afternoon, Ryan and Emily arrived as promised. I had baked a loaf of banana bread that morning and set out coffee mugs on the kitchen table. Emily entered first, smiling more warmly than she had at Thanksgiving. The sudden change caught my attention immediately. "The house looks wonderful," she said while looking around the room. "You always keep everything so beautiful." Compliments from Emily were rare. That alone made me cautious. Ryan sat across from me and wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. For a few minutes we discussed ordinary things. Weather, school activities, holiday shopping. Then Emily gently placed her cup on the table and leaned forward. "We have been thinking about your future," she said. There it was. The conversation I had expected. I nodded, but said nothing. Emily continued. "This house is a lot for one person to manage. The stairs, the yard, the maintenance costs. We just worry about you." Her voice sounded caring, concerned, reasonable. Years earlier, I probably would have appreciated the attention. Now I heard something else underneath the words. Preparation. Strategy. Ryan finally joined in. Maybe it would help if we explored other options. Other options. Such harmless words. Yet I remembered the journal entries from 5 years earlier. The discussions about downsizing. The repeated suggestions. The unusual persistence. I took a slow sip of coffee. "What kind of options?" I asked. Emily exchanged a quick glance with Ryan. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. "There are some beautiful retirement communities nearby," she said. "They have activities, transportation, everything you could need." I folded my hands together. "That is thoughtful." Emily smiled. She seemed encouraged by my calm response. "We even gathered some information for you." She reached into her purse and produced several glossy brochures. They slid across the table toward me. I looked down at photographs of smiling seniors walking through landscaped courtyards and attending social events. The images seemed pleasant enough, yet something about the moment felt strangely familiar. Not because of the brochures, because of Michael's notes. Years earlier, he had described almost this exact conversation before it ever happened. The realization was unsettling. It was as though I were reading one of his journal entries in real time. "I will look at them," I said. Emily's shoulders relaxed slightly. Ryan appeared relieved. They had expected resistance. Instead, I gave them patience. The same patience they had mistaken for weakness for many years. After another half hour, they left. I stood at the front window and watched their vehicle disappear down the street. Then I returned to the kitchen table. The brochures remained exactly where Emily had left them. I picked up the top one and noticed a handwritten note attached to the back. A contact name, a phone number, an appointment date already circled in blue ink. I stared at it for several seconds. Nobody had asked whether I wanted an appointment. Nobody had asked whether I was interested. The decision appeared to have been made already. Slowly, I set the brochure aside. Then I walked into the study and opened one of Michael's folders again. For the first time, I felt certain about something. Whatever Ryan and Emily believed was about to happen, They were operating under assumptions that Michael had anticipated years ago. And very soon, I intended to discover exactly how wrong those assumptions were. 2 days later, I scheduled a meeting with the attorney whose name appeared repeatedly throughout Michael's documents. His office occupied the second floor of a modest brick building downtown. There was nothing impressive about it.
No marble floors.
No sweeping views. Just quiet hallways, framed certificates, and the kind of calm professionalism that made people trust him with important matters. When I arrived, he greeted me warmly. "Margaret," he said, shaking my hand. "Michael always spoke highly of you." Hearing my husband's name still carried a weight that caught me by surprise. The attorney invited me into his office and waited patiently while I explained what I had discovered. I showed him the journal, the folders, the notes. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. "I wonder how long it would take before you came to see me." I stared at him. "You knew about all this?" "Not everything," he replied carefully. "But I knew Michael was concerned." Concerned. The word appeared again. It seemed everyone understood Michael's worries except me. The attorney opened a file cabinet and removed a thick folder bearing my husband's name. He placed it on the desk between us. "There are several documents Michael instructed me to keep on file," he said. "Most of them were never intended to become relevant." My pulse quickened. "And now?" He gave me a sympathetic look. "Now they are very relevant." He opened the folder and turned several pages. What followed felt less like a conversation and more like the slow unveiling of a puzzle. Years earlier, Michael had restructured portions of our estate. Certain properties, certain investments, certain accounts. Everything had been done legally and transparently. Yet the details remained known only to a very small number of people, including me, apparently. The attorney slid one document toward me. "Read the highlighted section." I adjusted my glasses and began reading. Halfway through the paragraph, I stopped. Then I read it again. My heart began beating faster. The house. The property Ryan assumed would eventually become his. The property Emily discussed as though its future had already been decided. It was not structured the way they believed. Not even close. Michael did this. I asked quietly. "Yes." The attorney nodded. After a series of conversations that made him uncomfortable, I thought about the journal, the repeated questions, the discussions about ownership, the suggestions about retirement communities. Suddenly, every piece seemed connected. "There is more," the attorney said. He opened another section of the file. Additional documents appeared. Trust agreements, property, protections, clauses tied to specific conditions. The language was technical, but the meaning became increasingly clear. Michael had spent years building safeguards around the things he valued most. Not because he distrusted family, because he understood human nature, especially when money entered the picture. By the end of the meeting, I sat in stunned silence. The attorney closed the folder and folded his hands. "Michael believed that character reveals itself over time," he said. He hoped these protections would never matter. Outside the office window, snowflakes had begun drifting gently through the afternoon air. I watched them for a moment. "What happens now?" I asked. The attorney smiled slightly. "That depends entirely on what you choose to do." As I drove home, I felt calmer than I had in weeks. Not because every question had been answered. Far from it. But for the first time, I understood something important. Ryan and Emily were making plans based on assumptions. Assumptions Michael had quietly prepared to challenge years before his death. And somewhere within the remaining documents was a final piece of information I had not yet uncovered. A piece so important that Michael had placed it behind an additional layer of instructions. Whatever it was, he clearly intended for me to find it only when the timing was right. And I was beginning to suspect that time was approaching very quickly. Over the next week, I followed the attorney's instructions carefully. I reviewed every remaining document, every note, and every page Michael had left behind. The final set of instructions was hidden inside a sealed envelope that could only be opened after consulting with legal counsel. When I finally read it, I understood why Michael had waited so long to reveal it. The document did not contain money. It did not contain property deeds. It contained something far more powerful. It contained conditions. Detailed conditions tied to future ownership, inheritance rights, and decision-making authority. Michael had created them years before his death. At the bottom of the page, written in his familiar handwriting, was a simple sentence.
People reveal themselves when they
Believe the outcome is already decided. I folded the paper carefully and sat in silence. Outside, December had arrived. Christmas decorations appeared throughout the neighborhood. Lights glowed from rooftops. Wreaths hung from front doors. Yet inside my house, I felt strangely calm. The uncertainty that had haunted me after Thanksgiving was gone. In its place stood clarity. 3 days later, Ryan called again. This time he sounded unusually enthusiastic. "Mom, Emily and I were hoping to host a family gathering next weekend," he said. "Nothing formal. Just everyone getting together before Christmas gets too busy." I knew immediately why they were calling. They believed progress had been made. They believed I was considering their suggestions. They believed the future was unfolding according to their plans. "That sounds nice," I replied. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Ryan seemed surprised by how easily I agreed. "Great," he said. "Everyone will be there." The following Saturday, I arrived at their home carrying a small tray of cookies. The house was full of relatives, cousins, neighbors, family friends. Christmas music played softly in the background. The grandchildren raced through the living room laughing. Emily greeted me with unusual warmth. "Margaret, you made it," she said brightly. Her smile appeared polished and practiced. Throughout the afternoon, I watched quietly. Emily moved through the room like someone already celebrating a victory. Several times I overheard conversations about future renovations, property values, and long-term plans. None of it was direct. None of it was openly inappropriate. Yet after everything I had learned, I noticed details I once would have missed. Near the end of the gathering, Emily guided the conversation toward me. "We have all been worried about you living alone," she said. Several guests nodded sympathetically. Ryan joined in. "We just want what is best for Mom." I smiled gently. "I appreciate that." Emily seemed encouraged. "Have you thought more about the retirement community?" she asked. The room grew slightly quieter. People listened, waiting, watching. I looked around the room. Faces turned toward me. Some curious, some concerned, some completely unaware of the history beneath the conversation. Then I reached into my purse and removed a neatly folded document. Not the final document. Not yet. Just enough. I placed it on the coffee table. "Actually," I said calmly, "I spent the last few weeks reviewing some important family records." Emily's smile froze for the briefest moment. Ryan shifted slightly in his seat. Neither spoke. Michael left detailed instructions. I continued. Much more detailed than I ever realized. The room remained silent. Nobody understood exactly what I meant, but Emily suddenly looked less comfortable than before. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. I did not explain further. I did not argue. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I simply smiled, picked up my coat, and prepared to leave. As I walked toward the door, I could feel their questions following me. Because for the first time, they understood something had changed. They just did not know how much. The week before Christmas passed quietly. Nobody mentioned the conversation at Ryan's house, but I could feel the change. Emily called twice. Ryan called 3 times. Their questions were casual on the surface. How was I doing? Did I need anything from the store? Had I looked at any retirement communities recently? I answered politely, briefly. For the first time in years, I was no longer reacting to events. I was waiting. On the morning of December 23rd, the attorney called. "Everything is ready," he said. "The final review can take place tomorrow." The following afternoon, several family members gathered at my house. Ryan and Emily arrived first. Other relatives followed shortly afterward. The atmosphere felt festive, but underneath it ran a current of anticipation. Emily seemed especially cheerful. She complimented the decorations. She praised the cookies I had baked. She even offered to help in the kitchen. The sudden kindness might have impressed me once. Now it simply confirmed what Michael had understood years earlier. As everyone settled into the living room, I placed a folder on the coffee table.
It was the same folder I
Had spent weeks studying. Conversations faded. Eyes turned toward me. Ryan looked curious. Emily looked cautious. I folded my hands and spoke calmly. Over the past month, I learned things about our family's plans that I did not fully understand before. Nobody interrupted. I also learned how much effort Michael invested in protecting the people and values he cared about. Emily's smile remained fixed, but I noticed tension in her posture. The attorney, who had joined us at my invitation, opened the folder and removed several documents. He explained everything clearly: the ownership structures, the trust arrangements, the conditions attached to future transfers, the protections Michael established years before his death. One by one, assumptions disappeared. The house would not automatically pass according to expectations that had quietly developed over time. Major decisions required conditions that had never been met. Certain authorities belonged solely to me. Other assets remained protected indefinitely. As the explanation continued, the room grew remarkably quiet. Ryan's expression changed first. Confusion gave way to surprise. Then, understanding. Emily stared at the documents without speaking. For once, she had no prepared response.
No polished argument. No confident smile.
Only silence. The attorney finally closed the folder. Mr. Collins was very thorough, he said. He believed important decisions should be based on responsibility, respect, and demonstrated character. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Ryan looked at me. Really looked at me. Perhaps for the first time in years. "Mom," he said quietly, "you knew all this?" I shook my head. Not until recently. The sadness in his eyes surprised me. I realized then that he had spent years listening to assumptions until they became facts in his mind.
He was not evil.
He had simply stopped paying attention. Emily remained silent. Her gaze never left the documents. I felt no satisfaction watching her reaction.
No triumph.
Only clarity. The truth had arrived on its own. It did not need my help. Later that evening, after everyone left, I carried a cup of tea into the living room and sat beside the fireplace. Outside, snow covered the neighborhood in a quiet blanket of white. The house felt peaceful again. Not because I had won something, because I had finally stopped doubting what I deserved. My eyes drifted toward Michael's photograph on the mantel. The same familiar smile looked back at me. For weeks, I had searched through documents trying to understand what he protected. Sitting there in the glow of the Christmas lights, I finally understood. It was never about money. It was never about property. It was never about ownership. Michael protected my dignity. He protected my right to be treated with respect. And in the end, that turned out to be the most valuable thing he left behind. Months later, life settled into a new rhythm. Some relationships healed slowly. Others remained distant. But every Thanksgiving afterward, I set the table without fear. I cooked the recipes I loved. I welcomed the people who genuinely wanted to be there. And whenever I passed Michael's empty chair, I smiled. Because the woman everyone thought was alone had discovered she was stronger than she ever imagined.